Gladiators, how they were physically forged and psychologically broken. You think the gladiatorial games were entertainment? No, it was a system. A system designed to turn human beings into living flesh for the mob. A system that broke their bodies, destroyed their identities, and stripped them of their last possession: human dignity. Today, I will tell you the truth about how ancient Rome created its killing machines, how they were physically forged and psychologically shattered. And I warn you, what you are about to hear is nothing like the movies. It is far, far worse. From funeral rite to an industry of death. Picture this. Smoke from a funeral pyre rises to the sky. On the ground lies the body of a noble Etruscan aristocrat. Around him stand shackled slaves, swords in hand. They did not come here by choice. They were forced. They were ordered to spill blood, each other's blood, to atone for the sins of the deceased. This is not entertainment. It is a sacrifice, a sacred ritual, human offerings at the graveside. This is how the story of the gladiatorial games began. Not as a spectacle, not as a sport, but as an Etruscan funeral rite. The Etruscans, an ancient civilization that inhabited modern-day Italy long before the rise of Rome, believed that the soul of the deceased could not pass peacefully into the afterlife without blood, without battle, without death. So, at the funerals of their nobility, they staged fights between slaves. Mortal combat, where the victor won his life, and the loser became an offering to the gods. The Romans adopted this tradition. The first gladiatorial games in Rome were not mass entertainment. They were human sacrifices disguised as ritual. Blood was shed, not for spectacle, but in memory of the dead. But over time, everything changed. The sacred rite morphed into a business, an industry, a form of mass entertainment that fed the ambitions of politicians, enriched the owners of gladiatorial schools, and turned human beings into disposable commodities. By the 1st century BC, the games had become the primary way to win the love of the masses. Politicians organized games to secure votes. The wealthy spent fortunes on spectacles to display their power. And the arenas, filled with thousands of spectators, all thirsty for blood. From a sacrificial rite, an industry of death was born, and for it to function, it needed people. Or rather, not people. Machines. Fighting machines that would kill on command. Ludus Magnus, the fortress of no escape. Now, let's journey to the heart of this industry, to Rome, to the year 81 AD. The Emperor Domitian orders the construction of the largest gladiator school in history. It was named the Ludus Magnus, the Great School. This was not just a building. It was a fortress, a prison, a death factory. The Ludus Magnus was situated in a valley between two hills, the Esquiline and the Celian, just a few dozen meters from the Colosseum. It was connected to the amphitheater by an underground tunnel, a dark, narrow corridor through which the gladiators walked to the arena. The only way out of the school led to one place: the sand, the roar of the crowd, and the embrace of death. The architecture of the Ludus was meticulously planned. At the center of the complex was a training arena, an ellipse measuring 62 by 45 meters. Here, gladiators practiced their strikes, learned to move, and fought each other with wooden weapons. Surrounding the arena were 3-story brick barracks, massive, grim, with no windows facing the outside world. This is where the fighters lived. This is where newly arrived slaves, prisoners of war, and criminals were housed. All those whom the system would turn into gladiators. The school's infrastructure was surprisingly advanced. There were running tracks for endurance training, wrestling pits for grappling practice, baths where gladiators washed after training, infirmaries with doctors who treated their wounds. There were even heated floors for the winter months. The Romans spared no expense on the school's upkeep. Because gladiators were an investment, an expensive, valuable investment. At the head of the ludus stood the lanista, the school's owner and manager. He was a businessman, not a warrior. His job was to profit from human lives. He bought slaves, hired volunteers, trained them, and rented them out for the games. But he didn't train the fighters himself. For that, he had doctores, instructors, former gladiators who had survived the arena, won their freedom, and now taught newcomers how to kill. Imagine you are a new arrival. You were captured in war. Or you committed a crime and were sentenced to the arena. Or you became so impoverished that you sold yourself into servitude voluntarily.
It doesn't matter. Now you are here, in the ludus. The massive gates slam shut behind you. You hear the shouts of fighters in training. You smell the stench of sweat, blood, and fear. You see a narrow corridor descending into darkness, and you understand there is no way out. The only path from here is through that tunnel to the arena, where either death or glory awaits you. But usually, it was death. The transformation into infamies, a legal death. Physical isolation was only the beginning. The true destruction of the self began with legal death. In ancient Rome, there was a special status, infamies. The word translates to the dishonored. People without honor, without rights, without dignity. Who fell into this category? Prostitutes, actors, pimps, and gladiators. Roman society considered them all the same, those who sold their bodies for the pleasure of others. It didn't matter that gladiators sold blood, not sex. It didn't matter that they risked their lives. In the eyes of Roman law, they were as contemptible as the women who sold themselves on the streets. What did the status of infames mean in practice? The complete stripping of all civil rights. Gladiators could not vote. They could not hold public office. They could not serve on juries. They could not sue or defend themselves in court. Their testimony had no legal weight. Their marriages were not recognized by law. They were legally dead while still alive. And here is the most terrifying part. This status was independent of origin. A slave became infames automatically upon entering a gladiator school. But even a free Roman citizen, even an aristocrat who voluntarily signed a contract to become a gladiator for money, lost all his rights. Forever. It was classic dehumanization. The system refused to see them as complete human beings. They became bodies, objects, things to be consumed. Imagine waking up one day to realize that you are no longer a person in the eyes of the law, that your opinion doesn't matter, that your life isn't protected, that you can scream, beg, and plead your case, but no one will listen, because you are infames, dishonored, a subhuman. This destruction wasn't physical. It was psychological. It killed the person long before the gladiator ever set foot in the arena. But the system's strangest paradox was that even volunteers, those who chose this path themselves, lost everything. There were cases of impoverished aristocrats selling themselves into the gladiator trade. They needed money. They signed a contract. And the moment they recited the gladiator's oath, a promise to endure fire, chains, beatings, and death at their master's command, they legally ceased to exist. They became the living dead, and there was no going back. The tetras system. the Greek science of breaking bodies. So, the man has been stripped of his legal status. He's been locked in a fortress with no escape. But that's not enough. Now, he must be turned into a fighting machine. And for this, the Romans used a scientific approach. They borrowed a system for training athletes from the ancient Greeks and adapted it for gladiators. This system was called the tetros, a 4-day cycle. How did it work? Day 1, preparation. Light exercises, warm-ups, stretching. The body is prepared for the strain. Day 2, intensity. Maximum exertion, heavy training, striking drills until complete exhaustion. Day 3, rest. The body recovers. Day 4, moderate exercise, skill reinforcement, light sparring. And then the cycle repeated, without breaks, without weekends, cycle after cycle, month after month, year after year. The Greeks developed this system for Olympic athletes, free men who trained for glory and honor. The Romans took it and applied it to slaves they were preparing for death. A cruel irony. But the most interesting part was the weaponry. Novices were not allowed to touch real weapons for months. They were forced to train with wooden swords and shields that were twice as heavy as the real thing. Why? To build strength, endurance, and muscle memory. When a gladiator finally held a real sword, it felt as light as a feather. This gave him an advantage in combat. The primary opponent in training was the palace, a wooden stake about 6 feet tall. Gladiators practiced their strikes on it thousands of times, thrusting, slashing, cutting, over and over, until it was automatic, until the movements became instinct. Archaeologists have found depictions of gladiators attacking the palace on ancient terracotta lamps from Cyprus. It was a universal practice, used across the entire empire. The ancient Greeks not only developed the training system, they also worked in the gladiator schools. Greek doctores were the most valuable instructors because they understood anatomy, biomechanics, and physiology. They knew how to push the body to its limit without breaking it, how to build strength and speed, how to turn a man into a lethal weapon. But this system wasn't humane. It was scientific, cold, efficient. The Greeks taught the Romans not only how to train gladiators, but also how to heal them, so they could return to the arena. So the investment wouldn't be lost, so the cycle could continue. Hordearii, the barley eaters, a diet for a beautiful death. Now, let's talk about nutrition, because the gladiator diet was strange, very strange. The Romans called them hordearii, barley eaters. This was not a compliment. It was a derogatory nickname. Because the staple of a gladiator's diet was barley, the cheapest grain, usually fed to livestock. What did gladiators eat? Barley, in the form of porridge or bread. Legumes, beans, peas, lentils, dried fruits, sometimes cheese, occasionally vegetable oil, rarely, very rarely, meat. It was a vegetarian, high-carbohydrate diet. Modern scientists have examined the skeletons of gladiators from a mass grave in Ephesus and confirmed it. Their diet was almost entirely devoid of animal protein. Why? Why didn't the Romans feed their fighters meat if they wanted to make them strong and fast? Because the goal was different. The goal wasn't lean muscle. The goal was fat. The high-carb diet caused gladiators to build up a layer of subcutaneous fat. This thick layer of fat, covering their muscles, protected nerves and blood vessels. When a gladiator was cut with a sword, the fat prevented the wound from being fatal. A blow that might sever a tendon on an athlete would only leave a deep gash on a gladiator. Painful, bloody, spectacular, but not deadly. And here's the most brilliant part. The fat made the wounds bleed profusely.
When a gladiator took a hit, blood would pour. The crowd in the stands would go wild. They saw blood. They saw suffering. They got the spectacle they paid for. And the gladiator would remain on his feet, still fighting, because his fatty armor was working. But the diet included another strange element. Galen of Pergamon, the famous Greek physician who worked at a medical school attached to the gladiator barracks, wrote that after fights, gladiators drank a beverage of ash lye. It was a solution of water and ash from burnt plants and bones. Why? It was a calcium supplement. The ash contained enormous amounts of calcium, which strengthened their bones. Scientists who studied gladiator skeletons found excessively high levels of calcium in their remains. They drank this concoction regularly. It was bitter, disgusting, but effective. Pliny the Elder recorded this practice in his writings. One can see the gladiators after combat being helped by drinking this ash lye. It was the doping of antiquity, a way to speed up the healing of fractures, strengthen the skeleton, and increase survivability. So, gladiators were not athletes in the modern sense. They did not look like bodybuilders with ripped muscles. They were sturdy, stocky men, covered in a protective layer of fat. Their bodies were engineered not for beauty, but for survival and spectacle. Engineered to bleed on the arena sand and keep fighting. Engineered to die beautifully. The medical paradox: to heal, only to kill again. And now for the most cynical part of all. Gladiators received the best medical care in the empire. Better than free citizens, better than Roman legionaries, better than merchants, craftsmen, and farmers. Slave gladiators were treated by elite physicians. And this was not an act of humanism. It was the protection of an investment. Galen of Pergamon, one of the greatest physicians of antiquity and doctor to Emperor Marcus Aurelius, began his career at a gladiator school in his hometown. He treated wounds, set fractures, and studied anatomy on the living and dead bodies of fighters. His methods were so effective that in his 4 years at the school, only one gladiator died from his wounds. For comparison, the mortality rate before his arrival was significantly higher. Archaeologists studying gladiator skeletons discovered something incredible. Their bone fractures healed cleanly, with smooth lines of fusion. It was professional work. In ordinary Roman citizens, fractures healed crudely, unevenly, with deformities, because they didn't have access to good doctors. But the gladiators did. Every ludus had an infirmary with a medical staff, Greek doctors who understood anatomy, assistants who dressed wounds, surgeons who amputated limbs when there was no other choice. All of this was available to slave gladiators because they were worth money, a lot of money. Imagine the paradox. A poor free Roman breaks his leg. He's a cripple for life. Next to him, a slave gladiator suffers the same fracture. He is treated by a professional physician. His bone heals correctly, and in a month, he is training again. Value was not determined by humanity. It was determined by economics. Gladiators were healed not because they were pitied. They were healed so they could return to the arena, so they could fight again, so they could die again, but not too quickly. It was an industry, a cold calculation, an investment in human life that paid dividends in blood on the sand. And this is, perhaps, the cruelest manifestation of the system. Not the killing, not the torture, but the care. The professional, efficient, emotionless care for a body that would be thrown to the wolves again tomorrow. To heal, only to kill again. To save a life, only to put it back in harm's way. A paradox that reveals the true face of the gladiatorial system. The economics of blood. Why death was a luxury. Many people think that gladiator fights always ended in death, that the loser died and the winner moved on. This is a myth. The reality was different. Death in the arena was a rarity, not because the Romans had become more humane,
but because it was too expensive. Here's how the economy worked. The organizer of the games, usually a wealthy politician or aristocrat, didn't buy the gladiators. He rented them from the school's owner. The rental fee for one fighter for one match was a set sum. But if the gladiator died, the organizer had to pay compensation to the school owner. And this compensation was enormous, up to 50 times the rental fee. Imagine, you rent a gladiator for 1,000 sesterces. He goes into the arena, fights, gets wounded, and dies. Now you owe the school owner 50,000 sesterces because you lost his investment, because it took years to train that fighter, because he could have fought dozens more times and generated more profit. Therefore, fights to the death were a luxury. Games with a guaranteed death were called sine missio, without mercy. They could only be organized with the emperor's permission, and only on special occasions, to celebrate military victories, anniversaries, or major events. In ordinary games, gladiators fought to first blood, to a serious wound, or until one was clearly outmatched. Then the referee would stop the fight. The defeated gladiator would drop to one knee and raise a hand, a plea for mercy. The referee would look to the game's organizer, or to the emperor if he was present. The decision of life or death was not made by the crowd, as movies depict. The decision was made by the one paying the bills. And most often, he chose missio, a pardon, because killing the gladiator meant paying a huge compensation, because it was better to spare him, heal him, and rent him out again, because economics was more important than blood. The statistics confirm this. Archaeologists estimate that the mortality rate in gladiatorial combat was around 10%. Not 50, not 70, 10. Most gladiators survived. They were wounded, but they survived, because their lives were worth money. This doesn't mean the fights were safe. They were brutal, bloody, and traumatic. Gladiators suffered fractures, deep wounds, and disfigurements. Many died from infections after the fight. But in the arena itself, death was a rarity, an expensive rarity. And here is the irony. The system that turned men into rightless slaves, that stripped them of their human dignity, that threw them into the arena for the crowd's entertainment. That same system protected their lives, not out of humanism, out of greed. Because a dead gladiator generates no profit. A living one does, again and again. Specialization to the point of absurdity. Niche soldiers for a grand spectacle. Now let's talk about the types of gladiators, because they were not all-purpose warriors, far from it. Each gladiator spent his entire career perfecting a single fighting style, one set of weapons, one tactical approach, for his entire life. The Murmillo was a heavily armed fighter with a large rectangular shield, a short sword called a gladius, and a helmet with a fish-shaped crest. He was slow but well protected. His job was to withstand blows and deliver powerful thrusts with his sword. The retiarius was his complete opposite, a lightly armored fighter with no helmet and no armor. His weapons were a net, a trident, and a dagger. He was fast and mobile. His goal was to ensnare his opponent in the net, trip him, and finish him with the trident. If the net missed, he relied on speed and distance. The secutor, or pursuer, was a type created specifically to fight the retiarius. He wore a smooth, streamlined helmet with no projections for the net to catch on. He carried a large shield and a sword. Slower than a Murmillo, but effective against light fighters. The Thracian, fought with a curved sword, a small rectangular shield, and greaves on both legs. His tactic involved swift, slashing attacks, striking from above, and pressuring his opponent. The Hoplomachus was armed with a spear, a small round shield, and a sword.
He combined long-range and close-quarters combat. He would attack first with the spear, then switch to the sword if his opponent broke through. And here's the crucial point. Each type trained separately. Each had his own doctor, an instructor who was a former gladiator of the same type. A Murmillo was taught by a former Murmillo, a Retiarius by a former Retiarius. They didn't share expertise. They didn't learn to fight with different weapons. It was narrow specialization, taken to an absurd degree. Why? Because gladiators were not warriors. They were performers, actors in a bloody theater. The crowd demanded a spectacle of contrasts, heavy armor versus a light fighter, defense versus speed, strength versus agility. It was a show, pre-planned, choreographed, and visually dramatic. Roman legionaries trained to be versatile soldiers. They knew how to fight in formation, use a spear, a sword, a shield, and adapt to different situations. Gladiators knew nothing but their one role. They were highly specialized machines for a single type of combat, like actors playing one part their entire lives, like circus artists repeating one trick thousands of times. And in this lay another form of dehumanization. Gladiators were denied versatility, denied choice, denied the ability to adapt. You were born a Murmillo. You would die a Murmillo. You would never know what it was like to fight with a net and trident. Your life was one style, one role, one path. The psychological noose, sounds, smells, and the Last Supper. Now let's talk about how the Romans broke gladiators psychologically. Because physical conditioning was only half the battle. The real subjugation happened in the mind.
And the most powerful tool was anticipation.
Imagine you are a gladiator. You've been summoned for the games. The fight is tomorrow. You know this. You walk through the underground tunnel from the Ludus to the Colosseum. A dark corridor, damp walls, dripping water. Above you, a thunderous roar. Thousands of feet stomping in the stands. The roar of the crowd. They are demanding blood. Your blood. You hear the sounds of the arena. Shouts, cries of pain, the clash of metal, the roars of wild beasts. Other gladiators are already walking ahead of you. Some of them will not return. You know it. They know it. But you must keep walking. The smell of smoke from sacrificial fires, the smell of sweat, the smell of blood, the smell of human and animal excrement, the smell of fear. It seeps into your skin, fills your lungs. You can't escape it. And you stand in this corridor, waiting for your turn, listening to your comrades die, hearing the crowd applaud their deaths, and you realize your turn is coming. Soon the gates will open, and you will step into the light, onto the sand of the arena, to the screams of tens of thousands of people who have come to watch you bleed. But before that, there is a banquet, the Last Supper. A few days before the games, gladiators were invited to a public feast. Wealthy Romans would host these dinners, and spectators would come to look at the fighters, to talk to them, to assess their physical condition, to place bets. It was part of the spectacle, the anticipation. The Greek philosopher Nicolaus of Damascus recorded a scene from such a banquet. When the guests were sated with food and drink, they called for the gladiators. As soon as one had his throat cut, the hosts applauded with delight. Can you imagine? Gladiators ate at the same table with the people who, in a few days, would be screaming for their deaths. They looked them in the eye, listened to their jokes, and then they walked into an arena to die for their entertainment. This was a psychological noose, a circle with no escape. You know you will soon die. You just don't know when. You hear death all around you. You smell it. You see it in the eyes of the spectators. And there is nothing you can do. Only wait. Only walk forward when the gates open. Some gladiators prayed before a fight. To unknown gods. To the old gods. To the gods of their ancestors, whom they remembered from a previous life, when they were free. Others just sat in silence, staring into nothing, preparing to accept death. And then the gates would open, a blinding light, the roar of the crowd, sand under your feet, and your opponent standing before you. A man just like you, a slave just like you, just as broken. And the two of you must kill each other for the amusement of people who will never even know your names. Women in Blood, the Gladiatrix, and Shattered Identity. Now, let's talk about something rarely discussed. Female gladiators. Yes, they existed. And no, these were not isolated incidents. By the 1st century AD, the Gladiatrix had become a regular part of the game's program. Who were they? Slaves, captives, criminals. Sometimes, volunteers from the lowest social classes who needed money, but most often, they were forced, sent to the arena against their will. What did they look like? They wore minimal clothing. Often, they were made to fight nearly naked. This was part of the spectacle, the sexualization of violence. The crowd came to watch not just a fight, but female bodies, to see blood mixed with flesh, to see humiliation elevated into entertainment. Whom did they fight? Animals, men of short stature, sometimes each other. They were rarely pitted against full-fledged male gladiators, as the outcome was predictable, but against dwarves, against dogs, against wild cats. That was a spectacle. It provoked laughter and excitement from the crowd, but the most terrifying part was the destruction of identity. A gladiatrix lost everything that made her a woman in the eyes of Roman society. She could not start a family. She could not marry. She could not bear children. She was forced to live like a man, in male barracks, under male rules, within a male hierarchy. But she wasn't a man. She was something else, something broken. It was a double dehumanization. As a gladiator, she lost her legal status, becoming infames, dishonored. As a woman, she lost her gender identity, ceasing to be what society defined her as. She was an object of dual contempt, a slave and a perversion, a thing for amusement, stripped of all dignity. Historians long debated whether the gladiatrix was a common phenomenon or a rarity. Archaeological finds provided the answer. They were common. Too many mentions in historical sources, too many depictions on reliefs, too many graffiti on the walls of ancient cities, where spectators discussed their favorite fighters and named women among them. This points to the systemic nature of the practice. Women were used in the arena regularly, not as an exception, but as part of the program, to add variety to the spectacle, as a way to show that the system could break anyone, even women, even those whom society considered weak and defenseless. Even they could be turned into killing machines. And when a gladiatrix stepped into the arena, she knew that no one would see a person in her. No one would pity her. No one would remember her name. She would just be part of the show. One more broken life in an endless stream of blood and entertainment, rumors and fame, from stars to prostitution. And now, the paradox. Gladiators were despised by law. stripped of their rights, equated with prostitutes. Yet some of them became stars, objects of mass adoration, darlings of the crowd. Popular gladiators enjoyed a level of fame comparable to modern celebrities. Their names were known throughout the empire. Their likenesses were painted on the walls of houses. Songs were written about them. They had fans who followed their every move. The crowd chanted their names in the arena. Women went mad for them, literally. Wealthy Roman matrons would buy small vials of their favorite gladiator's sweat. They would rub it on their skin as an aphrodisiac, believing it gave them strength and allure. Archaeologists have found these small glass flasks in the graves of Roman aristocratic women, the sweat of slave killers as a luxury item. But the rumors went further, much further. Roman men whispered that gladiators served as prostitutes for wealthy women, that high society ladies paid for a night with their favorite fighter, that gladiators sold not only their blood in the arena, but also their bodies in the bedroom. Whether this is true or not is unknown. There is no direct evidence, but the very existence of such rumors is telling. Roman men equated gladiators with prostitutes for a reason. Both sold their bodies for the pleasure of an audience. Both lost their human dignity. The only difference was that gladiators sold blood, not sex. But in the eyes of Roman society, it was one and the same. There were even rumors of empresses having affairs with gladiators. Enemies used these stories as weapons in political struggles. To say that an emperor's wife slept with a gladiator was to humiliate her to the lowest degree, because a liaison with a gladiator was worse than one with a common slave. A gladiator was not just a slave. He was infame, a subhuman, a thing. And here is the paradox. Gladiators existed in a space of contradiction, legally dead yet socially adored, despised by the law but loved by the mob. Their bodies were objects of consumption, both for combat and for sex. They were simultaneously celebrated and humiliated. They were stars and prostitutes, heroes and scum. This paradox made the psychological pressure even more intense, because a gladiator could never know who he truly was, a hero to be worshipped or a slave to be scorned, an object of admiration or a thing for amusement. He heard cries of love from the stands and saw contempt in the eyes of free citizens on the street. He was everything and nothing at once, a broken man in a gilded cage. Career paths, freedom after 5 years of hell. But there was hope. A small, faint, almost impossible hope, but it was there. A gladiator's career did not always end in death. There was a system of release. After 5 years of fighting in the arena, a gladiator could retire, if he survived. 5 years. Imagine that. 5 years of relentless training. 5 years of fights, any one of which could be your last. 5 years of wounds, fractures, and pain. 5 years of a crowd screaming for your blood. 5 years of living on the edge. And if you survived, they could let you go. Could. Not had to. Could. What came next? Freedom? Formally, yes. But what kind of freedom is it for a man who has lost all his rights, who was in fames, who legally remained a subhuman? Even a freed gladiator could not regain his lost status. He remained dishonored. He could not hold office. He could not participate in politics. Society remembered who he had been. But there were options. Some became doctores, trainers for new gladiators. They used their experience to teach the next generation. They passed on the knowledge they had gained at the cost of their own blood. It was a stable job, well paid, relatively safe, but it meant staying within the system, returning to the ludus,
hearing the roar of the arena again, witnessing death again, only now from the sidelines. Others became bodyguards. Wealthy aristocrats hired former gladiators for protection.
After all, who could protect you better than a man who had survived 5 years in the arena? Who could react to danger faster than someone accustomed to fighting for his life every day? Former gladiators were valuable bodyguards. But this, too, was selling one's body, selling the skill of killing, just for a different master. There were rare cases where both gladiators in a match emerged as victors, after a battle lasting hours, where both had shown exceptional skill and refused to yield. The emperor might grant freedom to both. The crowd would be ecstatic. It was the ultimate display of valor. Two warriors who fought to exhaustion but did not kill each other. Both worthy of life, both worthy of freedom. But such cases were the exception, a miracle. Most gladiators did not live for 5 years. They died from their wounds, from infections, from training accidents, from disease, from exhaustion, from despair. And those who did survive often couldn't leave because they knew nothing but the arena, because society would not accept them, because they were psychologically broken. Some returned voluntarily, signed another contract, stepped back onto the sand, because it was the only life they knew. The system offered the illusion of hope. 5 years of survival in exchange for potential freedom. A carrot on a stick that kept them moving forward. A psychological hook that maintained motivation. A dream that rarely came true, but one that was necessary to endure life. The revolt of Spartacus, when the broken rose up. But sometimes the system fails. Sometimes the broken refuse to stay broken, and then a rebellion occurs. The most famous in the history of gladiators, the revolt of Spartacus. The year is 73 BC, the city of Capua in Campania, the gladiator school of Lentulus Batiatus. About 70 gladiators form a conspiracy. They have learned that major games are coming, games in which many of them will die. They decide, enough. It is better to die free than to live as slaves. The plot is discovered. The owner learns of the conspiracy. He takes measures. He strengthens the guard. But it's too late. A group of gladiators breaks through. They grab kitchen knives, roasting spits, anything that can be used as a weapon. They kill the guards. They break free. Leading the escapees is a Thracian named Spartacus. Strong, intelligent, charismatic, a natural-born leader. Along with his comrades Crixus and Oenomaus, he takes refuge on Mount Vesuvius. Other slaves begin to flock to him, from nearby estates, from the mines, from all over the region. They hear the news. There is a man who has risen up against Rome, a man who has refused to remain a thing. The Romans dispatch a small force to crush the rebellion. A small force, 3,000 men. They think, these are just gladiators, slaves. They don't know how to fight a real war. But they are wrong. Spartacus descends from Vesuvius by night, surrounds the Roman camp, and annihilates the force. He captures their weapons. Now the rebels have swords, spears, armor. Rome sends another army, then another. Spartacus defeats them all. His army grows. By 72 BC, he commands 70,000 men. A well-organized army, with cavalry, with discipline, with tactics. This is no longer a slave revolt. This is a war for human dignity. Spartacus doesn't just want to escape. He wants to destroy the system that turns people into things. He wants to reclaim for himself and his comrades what was taken from them, the right to be human. The Roman government is in a panic. They send the armies of both consuls against Spartacus, their best legions, their most experienced commanders. A real war begins. Bloody, brutal, long. In the end, Spartacus is defeated. His army is shattered. He himself dies in battle. 6,000 captured gladiators are crucified along the Appian Way, the road from Capua to Rome. 6,000 crosses, 6,000 bodies, dying slowly in the sun. A lesson for anyone else who dares to rebel. But Spartacus did not lose, because he proved that the system could be broken, because he showed that gladiators are not things. They are people, capable of thought, capable of organizing, capable of fighting not for spectacle, but for freedom. The revolt of Spartacus was not just a rebellion for freedom. It was a rebellion against dehumanization. The gladiators refused to remain infamies. They reclaimed their human status by force. They told Rome, "We are not your toys. We are not your slaves. We are people, and we will fight until we prove it." And though they lost, their example remains etched in history, a reminder that even the most brutal system can be challenged, that even the most humiliated people are capable of resistance, that human dignity can never be extinguished forever. It can be reclaimed by force. The industry for manufacturing spectacular death. So, we have traveled the entire path, from the funeral rites of the Etruscans to a mass entertainment industry, from sacred sacrifice to commercial spectacle, from people to things. What was this system really? It was a machine of dehumanization, calculated, efficient, multi-layered. It operated on every level simultaneously. The legal level. The status of infamies stripped gladiators of their rights, turning them into subhumans in the eyes of the law. They could not defend themselves. They could not demand justice. They were legally dead while still alive. The physical level. The Tetras training system broke their bodies. Wooden weapons of double weight, endless strikes on the palace, cycles of exertion without rest, the transformation of a man into a fighting machine through pain and exhaustion. The biological level. The barley eater diet, a high-carb regimen designed to create a protective layer of fat. Calcium supplements from ash. A body engineered not for life, but for a beautiful death. For profuse bleeding on the arena sand. The medical level. Elite treatment for slaves, not out of humanism, but out of greed. Gladiators were healed so they could return to the arena, so the investment would pay off, so the cycle could continue. The economic level. A system of rental fees and compensations. Death was more expensive than life, so gladiators were spared, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. An economy of blood, where human life was measured in sesterces. The social level. The paradox of stars and outcasts. Gladiators were simultaneously adored and despised. They were celebrated in the arena and humiliated on the streets. They were objects of desire and objects of contempt. Broken men in a gilded cage. The psychological level. The anticipation of death. The sounds of screams from the dungeons. The smell of blood. The final banquets where spectators appraised them like livestock, a constant pressure that destroyed the will, turning men into obedient bodies, ready to die on command. The gender level. Female gladiators, stripped not only of their rights but of their very identity. A double dehumanization. The sexualization of violence, humiliation elevated into entertainment. The professional level. Specialization to the point of absurdity. Gladiators were not warriors, they were performers, actors in a bloody theater. They were denied versatility, choice, and the ability to adapt. One role for life, one death at the end. All of this worked in concert. It created a system of total control: physical, legal, psychological, social. The gladiator was trapped from all sides. He could not escape. He could not rebel. He could not even truly hope, because hope was an illusion, dangled by the system as bait. But there were paradoxes, strange, cruel paradoxes that reveal the true face of this machine. The paradox of medicine. Slaves received better medical care than free, poor citizens, because slaves were worth money and the poor were not. The paradox of economics. The system that turned people into disposable goods protected their lives out of greed. A dead gladiator brought no profit. The paradox of fame. Legally dead men became stars. Their names were known across the empire, but the law did not recognize them as people. The paradox of hope. The system offered the illusion of freedom after 5 years, but most did not survive, and those who did were often too broken to leave. The paradox of volunteers. Free men sold themselves into slavery voluntarily, out of need, out of desperation, and they lost everything: rights, dignity, future, forever. This system existed for centuries. It evolved. It was perfected. It grew into a colossal industry that fed thousands of people: school owners, trainers, doctors, game organizers, weaponsmiths, animal suppliers, everyone who profited from blood. The Colosseum could hold 50,000 spectators. 50,000. Imagine that. 50,000 people came to watch other people kill each other. They screamed. They applauded. They placed bets. They bought souvenirs. They ate. They drank. They were entertained. Death had become mass entertainment, an industry, the norm. And the most terrifying part is that society saw no problem with this. To the Romans, the gladiatorial games were as normal as movies or sports are to us. They didn't think about the fighters' human dignity. They didn't see them as people. They saw a spectacle, objects of consumption, things created for their pleasure. This is a classic example of institutionalized dehumanization. When a system is so deeply embedded in a culture that it is no longer perceived as violence, when cruelty becomes the norm, when an entire society participates in the destruction of human dignity and doesn't even notice. But the system was not invincible. Spartacus proved that. He showed that even the most broken people can rise up, that human dignity cannot be completely destroyed, that there will always be those who refuse to be things. And eventually, the system fell. Not at once, not quickly. But with the fall of the Roman Empire, the gladiatorial games disappeared. Christianity, having become the state religion, declared them barbaric. The arenas emptied. The ludi closed. The machine for manufacturing spectacular death ground to a halt. But its legacy remains, in our memory, in our films, in our ideas about ancient Rome. The gladiators became a symbol of resistance, a symbol of the fight for freedom, a symbol of a human dignity that cannot be completely taken away. We remember Spartacus. We remember his rebellion. We remember that he did not surrender, that he fought to the end, that he chose to die a free man rather than live as a slave. But we must also remember all the others. The thousands of nameless gladiators who passed through the Ludus Magnus, who trained to exhaustion, who ate barley porridge and drank ash lye,
who listened to the screams of their dying comrades in the dungeons of the Colosseum, who stepped onto the sand of the arena, knowing they might not return. We must remember the gladiatrices, stripped of rights and identity, put on display for humiliation and entertainment, broken twice, as gladiators and as women. We must remember the volunteers, free men who sold themselves out of need and lost everything, forever. We must remember the doctors and trainers who healed and taught, not out of humanism, but as cogs in the machine, who were part of the system that turned people into commodities. We must remember the school owners, the Lanistae, the businessmen of death, who profited from human lives, who saw gladiators only as investments. We must remember the spectators, 50,000 in the Colosseum, millions across the empire,
Ordinary people who came to watch death, who applauded murder, who demanded blood, who were part of the system. Because the gladiatorial system is not just ancient history, it is a lesson about what human society is capable of, how a system can normalize violence, how an industry can be built on blood, a lesson that human dignity is fragile, that it can be taken away by law, by force, by economics, by psychological pressure, that people can become things if society decides that it's normal. But it is also a lesson in resistance, that even the most broken people can rise up, that the human spirit cannot be completely destroyed, that there will always be a Spartacus, someone who refuses to be a thing and chooses to fight. The empty arena. Imagine an empty arena at dawn. The Colosseum is silent. The stands are empty. The sand has absorbed the blood of the previous day. In the dungeons, all is quiet. No screams, no thunder of feet overhead, no roar of the crowd. But at the Ludus Magnus, a new batch of captives is already entering. The massive gates slam shut behind them. The doctores prepare for a new training cycle. The palli stand in their places, scarred by 1,000 strikes. In the infirmary, bandages and medicines are being prepared. In the kitchen, barley porridge is cooking. The cycle begins anew. The machine starts up. The system is working. But somewhere in the mountains of Campania, an escaped slave is hiding. He has heard of Spartacus. He knows that rebellion is possible. He is waiting for his moment. The story continues. The struggle continues. Because as long as there are systems that turn people into things, there will be those who refuse to be things. There will be those who choose freedom. There will be those who fight. The gladiators are dead. The Roman Empire has fallen. The Colosseum stands in ruins. But the lesson remains. Human dignity cannot be taken away forever. It can be suppressed. It can be trampled. It can be declared non-existent by law. But somewhere, deep inside every person, it lives. And one day, it breaks free. Like it did for Spartacus. Like it did for the 70 gladiators who rebelled in Capua. Like it did for the thousands of nameless fighters who refused to die obediently. They were infames, the dishonored. But they won back their honor. By force. With blood. Through struggle. They proved that the system can be broken. That a person is stronger than a machine. That dignity
is more important than life. And that is their ultimate victory. Not a military one, not a political one, but a human one. They remained human in a system that did everything to turn them into things. This is what we must remember when we watch movies about gladiators, when we marvel at the Colosseum, when we study ancient Rome. Behind every stone of the arena is a broken life. Behind every spectacle is a destroyed dignity. Behind every applause from the crowd is someone's death.
The gladiators were not heroes. They were victims. Victims of a system that turned human life into a commodity, that made death an entertainment, that built an industry on blood. But some of them became heroes, not because they fought well, but because they refused to be things, because they rebelled, because they chose freedom over submission. Spartacus lost the war, but he won the battle for human dignity. His name has lived for 2,000 years. His example inspires. His struggle reminds us that the system is not all-powerful. A person can resist. A person can win. Even if victory costs a life. Even if the fight seems hopeless. Even if you are one against an empire. You can fight. You can rise up. You can remain human. This is the lesson of the gladiators. A lesson of blood and sand. A lesson of the Ludus Magnus and the Colosseum. A lesson from Spartacus and thousands of nameless fighters. Human dignity cannot be bought. It cannot be sold. It cannot be taken away by law. It can only be given up voluntarily, or defended to the last breath. The gladiators defended it, to the end. And that is why we remember them, not as entertainment, not as a spectacle, but as people. Broken, but not surrendered. Defeated, but not conquered. Dead, but alive in our memory. The arena is empty. The crowd has dispersed. The spectacle is over. But the story continues, because the fight for human dignity never ends. As long as there are systems that turn people into things, there will be those who refuse to be things. There will be new Spartacuses, new rebellions, new battles. Because the human spirit cannot be broken. It can only be taught how to fight. The gladiators taught us, with their blood, with their lives, with their struggle. They showed us what it means to be human in a system that refuses to see you as one. They showed us what it means to resist when resistance seems impossible. They showed us what it means to choose freedom when the price of freedom is death. Thank you for listening to the end. This is a difficult story, brutal, unpleasant, but it is important because it's about us, about what human society is capable of, and what the human spirit is capable of. Give this a like if this story moved you. Subscribe to the channel if you want more historical content that isn't like the textbooks. Write in the comments, what lesson did you take from this story? What does it mean to you? The story of the gladiators ended 2,000 years ago, but the lessons they left us are still alive today. Cherish your human dignity. Defend it. Do not let systems turn you into things. Resist. Fight. Remain human. Like Spartacus. To the end.